So in today's webinar, what I'll be covering is some of the highlights from our recent user group meeting. All the main sessions of the user group meeting have been recorded and edited by Penny, and those are now available within our Vernon CMS YouTube channel. So that's what I've got open here. And what I'll be doing is showing you some of the things that are features within Vernon CMS that were noted during our different client talks. So things that people highlighted that they were using in their projects, which might be relevant to many other people. So the first talk that we had was from Canterbury Museum, and they were talking about their whole massive redevelopment project. So that's involving demolishing some of the buildings, refitting some of them, and building a new section within the interior of the existing building. To allow that, they've had to move the whole collection off-site, and then they've had to start planning all of the new exhibition areas. And so one of the interesting things that came up in their presentation was that they're using the topic activity file within Vernon CMS to start planning those future exhibitions. So they're still years away, but they're able to use the topic activity to effectively start booking some of the objects that will go into those physical spaces so that people don't accidentally start maybe booking them for a loan when they're going to go in that exhibition, or maybe there's two different curators that both had a particular object in mind for different exhibitions within that new space. So we can see in this screenshot from our YouTube channel, part of their presentation where they were showing how they've created topics for different areas within that new exhibition area, and then they've created more specific topic records for sub areas of those. And so I'm going to just show you briefly within our demo system how the topic file works and show you a couple of other examples of how people are making use of that. So within Vernon CMS, there's the core cataloging module, and that has all the main features like the object and person file and the basic functions for editing and bulk updates on those. And then there's the optional activities module, which many of our sites have, and that manages about 16 different processes that can happen to objects in the collection. And so one of the key things with those activity files is that they can manage groups of objects that are involved in the same process. If I open up the topic section and go into the main topic entry file, topic is for recording any kinds of information which you want to group and apply to a set of objects. That can be diverse things like a blog post that you're writing that mentions several different objects. They can be topics that appear in the Vernon Browser public website interface, where you've created some kind of overarching information and you need a way of connecting together objects and people and subjects and so on. And they can be used to create content which is being shared with other platforms. And I'll show an example of that as well. So if I search within our demo system, we've got an example article about bee flies, which is one particular subset of insects. In the topic file, you would typically have a status to say at what point that topic is within the writing process. So you can help manage just the editing and approval of topics as content which you're reusing. And then each of those topics then would have, as a minimum, a title or name and a description. But there's also other fields for breaking down that content in other ways. So you can have keywords which link to other parts of the system, like the classification file. You can have subjects or abstracts, which might be used within some other interface to summarize the different topics that people can browse. And then most importantly, you have a list of whatever objects in the system are connecting to this particular topic article. Like all of the activity files, there's a number of administration fields which can help you manage that content as it's being created. So flagging what the purpose or intention of it is, flagging whether there's any particular rights that apply to this piece of content. And so one of the ways that we can publish that is to the Vernon Browser website, where that's one of the files that's supported. And so Queensland Museum is an example that's heavily using the topic file to create publicly accessible content. If I go to the Explore menu, there's a shortcut to get to the topic section. Their natural sciences departments are using topics to create general information about different subsets of animals. So for instance, they've got a topic about garden butterflies. And we'll see on this page the breakdown of information that we saw back in Vernon. Each of those topic records might have one or more images. So they've got images of typical types of garden butterflies. And then we've got the description, as we saw, and then some of those different keyword fields, like the subject categories. We do support an international standard for marking up the presentation of that content. That standard is called Markdown, and it allows you to apply common sets of formatting like italics, bold, links, bullet points. And so we'll see that within the Queensland Museum example here, where they've got different subsets of headings with bolds and italics. And then they've used the same concept that Canterbury Museum had, where they've got a hierarchy of topics. So garden butterflies is one particular topic, but then they've got individual topics for specific species of butterflies, because each of those different species, they have many different specimens, so many different object records. And it's nice to be able to have a topic record that summarizes that whole species. So I could click on one of those, perhaps the evening brown butterfly, and again, that's another specific topic record. At that level, if they wished, they could link to specific specimens they had of those, and they would exist in the object file back in Vernon. So that's a quick example of how the topic file can be used. So that can be publishing to any third-party resource. We've had people use the topic file to contribute to Google Art so that they can have overarching topics in the same kind of way. The second presentation that we had was from Parramatta, City of Parramatta, where they manage the archives, and they were using a number of different tools directly in Vernon CMS to help them clean up and review the data. And I was just going to show some of the tools that they're making use of. Firstly, to help their cataloguers, they're relabeling some of the fields so that they better match their own internal cataloging standards. So all of the standard fields within Vernon have a default label. So name title, for instance, is our main name field. You can override any of those labels, and then those overrides will apply in all of the different standard screens, including searching, list manager, and the data entry screens like I am here now. So to relabel a field, that's one of the system supervisor functions. If I go to system maintenance, there's a number of different user-driven parameters, and overriding the field names is one of those. So I'll just do a test example where I change the label for the name title field. The screen will show any other label overrides that you already have, and I can simply add more rows there, picking other fields. I already know in this case I just want the name title field, and so I could type that in, but there's also options available showing you all of the fields that exist. So I might be dealing with solely an art collection, and I might decide that title of work is a more appropriate label for that field. So let's change that field. We can call it title of work, and then the system will show me the other places that that's made use of. So anywhere where I'm doing a search, I also want it to have the same wording. But in some cases, you might have slightly different wording, an abbreviation, for instance, because perhaps that part of the user interface just maybe won't fit the length of label that you might have on a different screen. So you've got that kind of granular control where you can have slightly different variations of that to fit what's actually available within the layout of those screens. It's then showing me that that field appears in a whole range of different report options, and I could override it in all of those. But this is enough of an example so that we'll see that working in practice. So I'm going to save those changes. And now when I go back to those screens, we'll briefly see the default label. and then it'll detect whether there's any overrides and automatically change that. I haven't actually changed. So one of the fields I skipped that it would have been showing me was that it was specifically on the object identification screen. So let's just go back there and we'll be able to see what I missed. So we'll now see that I've got two fields available. And so at the bottom, the section that I skipped, one of those was actually the object ID screen. So every individual screen, we have the potential of having slightly different labels. And we can see already some of those screens have more specific labels because of the type of objects that that screen is dedicated to. So I should have, in fact, also changed it on the ID screen. And so now I can save that record. And that change is going to flow through now. So that's something where you can do on any field. Sometimes there might be a group of similar fields where changing the conceptual name of that would affect all of those. An example would be the primary maker field. If you change primary maker, then you're probably also going to want to change primary maker role, primary maker ethnicity, and so on. There's a bunch of different fields that relate to primary maker where usually it wouldn't make sense to change just one of those. So those are things that we can help you directly with through a support ticket. The second area that City of Parramatta were making use of was the user view screen. So let's do a search and just find one or more example records in our demo database. The user view screen is one of the last screens that's available in each of the different major files within the system. And that allows you to create any number of pre-built layouts for the information in that record type. I can click on the Select View button on the right to see what different views have already been created, and I can switch to one of those. So if I wanted to go to the registrarial full details layout, I can pick that. And it's almost like a pre-built report. It's including only the specific fields you've chosen, and they could be in any number of original data entry windows, and it's including them in the order that you want, with any specific label overrides, with or without the images. I'll show you whereabouts in system maintenance that's set up, and we'll look at that specific example to see what the settings were to enable that. That's again in the user-defined parameters section, and it's under user view configuration. There's a number of pre-built views in the system which you can't delete. And one example of those is the one-line summary for each major file. So we can see at the top of that object screen in the background, I've got accession number, I have the maker, the title, the classification, all as a quick summary that scrolls over a couple of different lines. And that's just a built-in view in the system. If I click on the advanced search screen, it'll just show me all of the views that exist. And so let's look at a couple of those. We'll look at the one-line display for object, which was working out that display at the top. And then we'll also look at that registrarial view. The one-line displays for an object can be specific to department, and for larger organizations, that can be very useful. The fields that a natural science record needs to display might be very different to social history, and so then using the department as a filter, you can then set a different subset of fields to present. In our demo system, though, we just have an all departments view, and then these are the different fields that are presented. If any of those fields are missing on a specific record, that data just won't appear. So we can see we've got a couple of flags up front, which for most of our records won't have any information in, but it's particularly important. So we've got a deaccession flag to see if something is maybe a candidate for deaccessioning. And then we have from the restriction field in Vernon, it's looking to see whether this particular item has been flagged as being culturally sensitive. So you can do very specific rules like that, showing only an entry in a particular field if it's a certain type. Another example of those special categories would be hazards. You might have a special warning flag, which shows if the object has a hazard present in it. And that means anywhere where there's the one-line summary, any kind of search or update interface, including location moves, you would see that hazard flag showing up. And so the second of those views was the one that we looked at before, the registrarial full details. And that's just got a long list of all the different fields in order that it's going to present. I can click on an individual field to go to more details. And that's where I can do things like change the label just for that one single layout. I can also change font size and general formatting at the field level. So that's the user view screen. City of Parramatta were also often taking the information out of Vernon CMS to review in Excel and sometimes send to people that were inquiring about that set of items. So if I wanted to easily copy this set of vases out to an Excel spreadsheet, that's a feature that's built within List Manager. I'll click on the List button in the top toolbar. We've got 3 default columns, which I've already set as the preference for my particular login into Vernon CMS, and we can easily add and remove columns, view, and change fields menu option. So perhaps in addition to those 3 columns, I might also want to see the department and the brief description. So I'll just double click on each of those, and those will become 2 more columns. And now I'm ready to copy that information out to Excel, where it'll take whatever columns I currently have with or without images. So I can say copy to Excel with the images or without images. Let's do with images. It'll automatically resize the source image down to a reasonable size within Excel, and it has that as a floating image over the top of each row. Excel isn't natively that good at managing images within a spreadsheet. We're managing that by doing it as a little floating box. So if I clicked on that, you'll see that that's floating there. The disadvantage of that is that you can't later resort the text content within Excel because the images are just floating over the top of that page and they won't be sorted with the data. So one caveat would be that if you need that sorted, do that in List Manager before you copy that information to Excel. So we could see in our one-line summary, we had different flag fields that were showing as part of the one-line display. So some of the flag fields that are particularly useful are in the administration screen. So we have restriction type and general flag, and City of Parramatta was using that to flag subsets of objects that had some special restriction or some special administration process that applied to them. That's a pair of fields that we'd encourage you to use. They're just term fields where you can create categories that are relevant to your collection. And then you can add on the individual objects one or more terms that might apply to them. In my example, I was looking for objects that were culturally sensitive, and it was dependent on this particular restriction type. The last example that they showed in their talk that I'll present is the option to bulk change the status of a set of records. So every object has a single procedural status that says at what point is it within its lifetime as an item within our collection. All of the activity files also have the same status field, and that says where they're up to in that particular process. On the Tools menu, there's an option to update a whole set of records to advance them to a future procedural status step. And so I can do that through bulk procedural control status update. So that first prompts me as to what's the file that I'm working with. So it might be a whole lot of objects that we were considering acquiring, and that's now been approved. And rather than going to each individual object and updating it, it might be easier to take that list of objects and then advance them all at the same time so that they're marked as accessioned. So let's pick object as our data file. The object file is the only case where we actually have two different status fields. There's the main status, where they might currently be marked as candidate, but then objects that are already in our collection and are marked as accessioned, there's a second field for keeping track of the deaccession process. So something might be accessioned, and at the same time, it might have a deaccession status of candidate deaccession. So that's a way of managing things which you're thinking about removing from the collection, but still keeping that status to mark, well, currently its legal status is still accessioned, even if we're considering changing that in the future. So in my case, I just need to update the main procedural status field, and then the rest of the fields are self-explanatory. We're marking the status that it's moving to, we're selecting a list of records that that's going to apply to, and then optionally we can fill in other notes and action person just as part of the history of that change. The next talk that I was going to mention is Waikato Museum had acquired a significant fossil collection, and they were making extensive use of the XML Import tool within Vernon CMS to bring all of that base catalogue data into Vernon. So they had in spreadsheet form a summary of each of the different fossils that they'd decided to acquire, and they didn't want to re-enter that information. So we have a process for converting Excel data into the XML data standard that Vernon CMS uses, and then configuring an import to say where in the system will all of that information go, and to properly validate it as we do that import. I've got an Excel spreadsheet already open to show as an example. So this is a set of snow globes which I've catalogued, and I want to bring all of this information directly into Vernon rather than retyping this. So this is using our standard Excel spreadsheet, which, as well as having the data sheet for all of the information, it has a control tab to say where do you want to generate the file to that this data will be sent to before it gets imported to Vernon. So this is doing that conversion step that I mentioned, where it's taking Excel's native format and converting it into Vernon's format. I've already generated this data out to that file, and I can now go into Vernon and configure and import that information. XML Import is one of the tools menu options, and it's under XML Import. And then I can either go straight to import if I've already set this up before, or I can start at the configuration screen, where primarily we're concentrating on the mapping of those columns in Excel and telling Vernon what's the right name of field that each of those will go to. So I've already got my configuration set up. I've just created one which I've called Snow Globe Object File. And I'll just go off to that configuration record to briefly show you how that process works. Each of those configurations tells Vernon which is the file that you're bringing the information into. So you could be importing person records as well as object records as an example. If they're going to be new records, the status field is required, so you have to set what status they're going to be. You can say what's the file by default that this process would be looking for. And then on the mapping page, every one that's marked as an imported field is one where the column has to match what we had in that Excel data. So these are the lowercase column names that I had back in Excel. This process also supports adding information which will be identical for every record in that import, and we call that static data. And so every one where we see static text, it's importing either a text entry or a particular code if it's in a term file. It does support importing things by their term name, but it's more likely you might find multiple matches during the import process. So if you know the ID of a particular term, so these are departments, object types, and collections, then the ID is a guaranteed way to get an exact match during that import process. Some of those columns in Excel you might want to group together so they appear as a row in one of the tables of the catalogue record. And so to support that, you have to tell Vernon which things are grouped together, because that's not obvious just from all of the sundry columns that you have in your Excel data. And so that's what this table group column does. All of the things where the same group number's used, those columns of information will appear as a single row in the destination table that it goes into. So that table group doesn't refer to a particular row number. It's just a mechanism by saying, well, the things with the same number are going to be logically grouped together, and you can just arbitrarily assign numbers as you go. So if we scroll down this, we can see lots of different tables. Cataloguer and catalogue date is another example. So that was the 5th group that I had within that data set. The last thing we have is record matching. So that's where you're deciding whether you're creating entirely new records in this process, or whether you want to match to records that already exist in Vernon and just append some new information. So in this case, these are new records, but you might be, for instance, updating the valuations of existing records. Your Excel data might only include the system ID or accession number, and that's the mechanism by which you're matching to the existing records. And then it might just have the name of the person that did the valuations and the new valuation amount. And that would be enough then for you to bulk update all of those records based on their numbers and add the new valuation detail. So let's run that import. My particular import isn't in that V drive location, so let's browse to find where I put it. I've just put it in a folder called XML examples, and I actually renamed it as snow globes. So I'll pick that and I'll click on import, and it'll be at this step that it checks every field of every record and flags any data that doesn't actually fit the rules that we currently have within Vernon CMS. And so it's flicking through those records. And then on the 5th record, that's the first record where it's found something where it doesn't match what we currently have set up within Vernon. So in this case, it's saying that it's found one cell in the original data that had the word importer in, and we're trying to put that into the primary production role field, and that's not one of the valid terms that currently exist in that file. In the bottom half of the screen, it shows me the full information that we're currently importing for that record, because that's often useful for you understanding what's the context of this one thing that didn't correctly match. And then based on that, you can decide what you're wanting to do. You could, for instance, just skip that entirely and you might sort it out later. But more likely, you would use the match field to search for an alternative term, or you would use this create a new term button to add importer with whatever spelling you wanted and whatever upper and case convention you wanted directly within Vernon, so that you can forever use that in the future. So let's create a new term for importer in the production role file, and we'll just use the same upper and lower case as we had in our import data. And we'll save that. And so now we can decide what we're going to do for the rest of the records in the import. So we might say we've found a match term and we just want to continue on and use that same match if it ever finds that in any other records that exist in that Excel data. So that'll mean it won't prompt us again through the rest of the import. There were some other entries that had importer in, but it's been able to successfully go past those. And so now our import's complete. It gives us the option of opening those records if we want to have a preview of those. And so these are the records now successfully created in Vernon, and I click on the window button to see them in the ID screen. And so as well as that information that we saw in Excel, we've got the other static detail. So for instance, social history was that code 5 we saw before. So code 5's automatically been added to every record in the department field. So we've got that extra information that wasn't part of the Excel spreadsheet. And that's exactly what Waikato Museum were doing, that they had a fossil department and they could automatically flag that for this whole subset of records. So that's a really powerful tool, which we have some existing videos on in our YouTube channel. And it's also something where we often get support questions, and we're happy to help you with that mapping process and just understanding how all of these pieces fit together. The last talk that we had was from Auckland Museum, which we're talking about how they're managing hazards within their collection, how they're making use of the fields which are available within Vernon CMS for that. So if I do a search, let's see if we can find some records where there's already maybe some particular risks or hazards noted. So we've got risks where objects are perhaps fragile or sensitive in some way, and we want to flag that they are potentially at risk to some external factor. And then secondly, we have hazards where the object itself has something in them which could be dangerous either to the environment or to people. Let's search for objects that have some kind of hazard noted in them. I'll just select all of the different hazards that we have created. And there's one single object. If I expand the left navigation, we can see that the risk assessment section is in administration and risk assessment, and it's as a separate tab on that window. So if I go to tab 2, that's where we've got the two tables documenting that an object might have a risk that is posed to it, or that it's got a hazard which it might pose to other things. This particular object has been marked as having lead toxins in it. We could be more specific and use any of these other further columns to mark when it was assessed and what kind of measurements we'd taken. Maybe we'd recorded the actual weight in milligrams of lead that's present in a particular object. And then both of those tables can also build up a set of history entries over time. So hazards might potentially be removed or treated in some way, and you can note that with different assessment dates. Both the risk type and the hazard type entries link to a central file where you can document the general principles that apply to that specific type of entry. So if I go to the related risk hazard type file, we can see what things we could describe for a particular hazard. So in this case, lead toxins has been created as one particular hazard type. I can say what types of materials would typically pose that kind of risk. I can say what the impact is, so I've restricted that specifically to human and animal health. You might describe any policies or procedures that need to be applied when the objects have those hazards within them. And in fact, we can see that that automatically shows up on the object screen in the background. So those grey columns are columns that automatically display from the shared related risk and hazard type record. So that makes it really useful to record detailed information in that file, because it then becomes really visible on every single object that's been linked to those. We could then go into further detail, saying what people within our organisation maybe are particularly responsible for managing those. Some risks or some hazard types have particular certifications for handling those, and there might be particular staff members that have achieved those certifications, and so you could note those in the person and role table. Lastly, there might be particular recommendations that you have for each of those. So for instance, objects that have asbestos present in them might need to be stored in a particular area of the museum, and you could note that as part of the recommended storage. So those risks and hazards can also be augmented by third-party resources. And so Megan Harvey, when she was talking about what they're doing at Auckland Museum, noted a really great website that we weren't aware of. And so she pointed out the Hidden Hazards website that Otago Museum have created. So that was a lottery-funded project to document all of the common hidden hazards that objects have in them and how you deal with those. So if I click on the hidden hazard section, we'll see the breakdown. So we might decide that we need to know more about how we handle batteries. I could click on that, and each section has a summary and a whole lot of common questions and answers that you should be thinking about. For instance, what legally do we have to do to manage these different things? In regards to batteries, there aren't any specific laws in New Zealand to how we're storing and managing those, but there are different guidelines in terms of personal protection equipment, for example. So that site's hiddenhazards.otagomuseum.nz, and it's a really useful resource regardless of which country you're in. There are similar websites for other regions. So I know that there's one in Australia that has some Australian specific law, and similarly there'll be ones in the US and the UK.